Persia threw everything it had at Greece. 2 invasions, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the full weight of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever built. And Greece, a collection of small, feuding city-states on a rocky peninsula, stopped them cold. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Every time Persia came, Greece held. For one extraordinary decade, the Greek city-states acted as one, and the mightiest military force on earth could not break them. Then Greece went back to hating each other. And 50 years later, a man from the north, a man most Greeks didn't even consider truly Greek, did what Persia never could. He took Greece. All of it. Not through fire and mass slaughter. Not through the kind of conquest that leaves cities in ash. Through something far more sophisticated, far more patient, far more terrifying. Because everyone who lived through it kept telling themselves it wasn't conquest at all. Right up until the moment it was too late to stop it. His name was Philip. He was king of Macedon. He was 23 years old when he came to power, and his kingdom was 4 days from ceasing to exist. Within 20 years, Greece was his. This is how he did it. To understand what Philip did, you have to understand the Greece he found. Because the Greece of 360 BC was not the Greece of Marathon. That Greece, young, electric, unified by existential fear, was gone. What remained was a civilization that had spent a century methodically tearing itself apart. It started with Athens. After defeating Persia, Athens did what victors often do. It built an empire. The Delian League, originally a defensive alliance, quietly became an Athenian protection racket. Tribute flowed in. The Parthenon went up, paid for with other people's money. And Sparta, watching from the south, grew increasingly certain that Athenian power was an existential threat to everything it stood for. In 431 BC, Sparta went to war with Athens. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years. 27 years of plague, siege, massacre, and naval catastrophe. Athens sent its greatest fleet to conquer Sicily and lost it entirely. Ships, men, generals, all of it, in a disaster so complete that Thucydides, the historian who documented the war, could barely find language adequate to the scale of the loss. Persia, watching from the east with cold calculation, decided the correct strategy was to fund whichever side was losing. So the Greeks would keep killing each other indefinitely. Athens fell in 404 BC. Its walls were torn down to music. Sparta celebrated. It wasn't over. It was never over. Within a decade, Sparta had made itself so hated, through brutal governors, through garrisoned cities, through the arrogance of victors who confused winning a war with the right to rule forever, that a new coalition rose against it. Then Thebes produced Epaminondas, arguably the greatest general of the era, and at Leuctra in 371 BC, he did something the Greek world had believed was physically impossible. He broke a Spartan army in open field battle. The Spartans, 200 years of unbroken battlefield supremacy, broke and ran. Their king died. Their legend evaporated in a single afternoon. Thebes was now the dominant power in Greece. And then, 11 years later, Epaminondas died at the Battle of Mantinea in a messy engagement that settled nothing, and Theban power collapsed almost immediately. Because Theban power wasn't institutional, it lived in one man's mind. When that mind went dark, everything he had built went with it. By 360 BC, Greece had no hegemon. Athens was cautious and cash-strapped. Sparta was a shadow. Thebes was leaderless. A new sacred war was beginning to drag city-states into yet another round of exhausting conflict. Persia still sat in the east, rich and watchful, content to keep Greeks divided forever. This was the board Philip inherited. He didn't create the vacuum. He just understood it better than anyone else alive. To most southern Greeks, Macedonians were barely civilized, ruled by kings instead of citizen assemblies. Their nobles drank heavily and feuded tribally. Their royal court was a place where assassination was a routine political instrument. Philip's own father had survived multiple attempts on his life. Several of Philip's brothers had not. This was the world he grew up inside. Volatile, violent, one bad day away from collapse. Philip was the third son, which in Macedonian politics meant he was heir to nothing in particular, and not being heir was almost as dangerous as being heir. When he was 15, he was sent as a political hostage to Thebes. A common diplomatic practice: loan a young royal to a rival power as insurance of good behavior. He spent 3 years there, 3 years in the city of Epaminondas, 3 years inside the most innovative military mind in the Greek world. He watched how the oblique attack worked, stacking infantry 50 ranks deep on one wing to create unstoppable mass. He saw how cavalry and infantry could function as a single coordinated system rather than separate arms. He observed the sacred band, 300 elite fighters bound by personal loyalty, and understood exactly what made them lethal. Not just their training, their cohesion. The fact that every man on that field was fighting beside someone he would die for. Philip came home a different person. He came home with a blueprint no Macedonian king had ever held. He did not have long before he'd need to use it. In 359 BC, his brother Perdiccas III led an army northwest to fight the Illyrian tribes who had been raiding Macedonian territory for years. Perdiccas didn't just lose, he was killed, along with 4,000 of his soldiers. The Macedonian army was shattered, the kingdom was defenseless, and within days, 4 separate rival claimants materialized on the borders, each backed by a different outside power. Athens, Thrace, Illyria, Paeonia, each one representing a different path to Macedon's extinction. Philip was appointed regent for his infant nephew. He was 23 years old. The kingdom under his charge was a political corpse, with enemies closing in from every direction. What he did next tells you everything about who he was. He did not fight. Not yet. He moved fast, but not with soldiers. He bribed 2 of the pretenders into withdrawing. He opened negotiations with Athens, offering to give up Macedonian claims to Amphipolis, a strategically vital city on the Strymon River, in exchange for Athenian neutrality. He was making a promise he had no intention of keeping. The point was not the promise. The point was the months it bought him. Days even. Time to breathe. Time to build. Then he turned to what remained of his army, and he began to work. The sarissa changed warfare, a Macedonian pike nearly 18 feet long, almost double the length of a standard Greek spear, wielded two-handed by infantry drilled to lock formation and advance as a single mass. 6 spear points reached an enemy soldier before any Macedonian body came within striking range. Greek hoplites, trained for individual courage and close-quarters clash, had no answer for a wall of sarissas moving forward in coordinated silence. But Philip wasn't only building better infantry, he was building a system. The companion cavalry, Macedonian nobles, mounted as shock troops rather than skirmishers, became the hammer. The phalanx became the anvil. Light infantry screened the flanks. Engineers with catapults and siege towers meant fortified cities could be reduced rather than bypassed. and Philip coordinated all of it together in a way that Greek military thinking, still fundamentally organized around the single clash of two hoplite lines on open ground, had not yet imagined. He also paid his soldiers, year-round, as professionals. The Greek city-states relied on citizen soldiers, farmers and merchants who mustered in summer and went home in autumn. Philip was building the ancient world's first standing professional army. Men for whom soldiering was not a seasonal obligation, but a permanent identity. They drilled continuously. They could move in winter. They could operate in mountain terrain that would have stopped any Greek civic army in its tracks. Within a year of taking the regency, which he quietly converted into kingship, the immediate crises were solved. He swept the Paeonians back across the northern border. Then he turned on the Illyrians, the same people who had killed his brother, under their king Bardylus. The battle was decisive and without mercy. 7,000 Illyrians died. The northwest frontier closed. Macedon exhaled. Philip was only beginning. Map Philip's expansion across the years, and you notice something immediately. It doesn't look like conquest. It breathes, strike, consolidate, offer terms, strike again, consolidate, offer terms. Every gain digested before the next move. Every military action preceded by diplomacy, and every diplomatic gain protected by the threat of military action. It was a rhythm unlike anything Greece had seen, not the headlong rush of an empire in fever heat, but the patient, methodical pressure of a man who had decided to win and was in no particular hurry. In 357 BC, Philip took Amphipolis, the city he had explicitly promised Athens he would not take. He marched his army in and took it. Athens was furious. Athens sent protests. Athens did not send an army. This was the first great demonstration of Philip's core insight into power. Outrage without consequences is just noise. Athens was stretched thin, diplomatically isolated, not yet frightened enough of Macedon to mobilize the resources a real confrontation would require. Philip had calculated correctly that the distance between Athenian anger and Athenian action was wide enough to march an army through. He kept marching. Pydna fell. Potidaea fell. And Philip demonstrated another layer of his method by handing Potidaea to the Chalcidian League as a gift, showing that cooperation with Macedon paid better than resistance. The gold mines of Mount Pangaeus came under Macedonian control. Revenue that had been a trickle became a flood. Philip began minting gold coins, the stater, which would become the dominant currency in the Greek world, and using that wealth to fund not just soldiers but spies, informants, politicians, and factions inside Greek city-states. He bribed where he could, negotiated where he couldn't, and fought only where he had to. 7 marriages across his reign were not personal excess. Each one was a treaty. Thessalians, Illyrians, Thracians, Epirotes. Philip bound the neighboring peoples to Macedon through kinship and obligation, weaving the periphery into the center with bonds that functioned as both alliance and insurance. One of those wives was Olympias of Epirus, fierce and deeply religious. She would give him Alexander. Then the sacred war handed him something he couldn't have manufactured on his own. In 356 BC, the same year Philip took Amphipolis, remarkably the same year Alexander was born, the Phocians seized the sanctuary at Delphi and its treasury. Delphi was not merely a religious site. It was the spiritual center of the Greek world, the place where city-states sent delegations to ask the oracle for guidance before wars, before treaties, before any decision of consequence. To control Delphi was to touch something that ran deeper than politics. deeper than money, into the foundational self-understanding of every Greek state. The Amphictyonic League, the council that governed Delphi, declared a sacred war against Phocis. Thebes and Thessaly mobilized. The Phocians, funding mercenaries with Delphi's gold, fought back with uncomfortable effectiveness. The war ground on for a decade, bleeding everyone who touched it. Philip watched. When Thessaly began to buckle under Phocian pressure and its leaders appealed for help, Philip came south. He fought 2 battles, lost the first. Then, with the methodical adaptability that defined his generalship, restructured and won the second so completely that the Phocian army was broken. The Thessalians, in gratitude, voted him archon, supreme commander, of their confederation. A Greek institution had just formally granted authority to the king of Macedon. Philip had not conquered Thessaly. Thessaly had invited him in and voted him power. He now commanded Thessaly's cavalry, the finest light horse in Greece, as a legitimate extension of Macedonian authority. He was no longer a northern king imposing himself from outside. He was a Greek political actor, embedded in Greek institutions, operating through Greek legal frameworks. That distinction was everything. It was the precise mechanism by which conquest could be made to look like leadership, and it was only the beginning of how he would use it. Athens was not blind. Part of Athens was not blind. In the Athenian assembly, a lawyer named Demosthenes had been watching Philip for years. He was not a general. He was not an aristocrat. He was a professional orator, a man who had built his career on the art of persuasion and what he was trying to persuade Athens of, with escalating urgency, with a desperation that sharpens and then begins to crack, was that Philip of Macedon was going to end Greek independence if Athens did not act immediately. The Philippics, the speeches he delivered against Philip across 15 years, are among the most urgent political documents in ancient literature. Not because they are eloquent, though they are, because they are right. And you can hear in them a man screaming into a room where no one is listening hard enough. Philip does not sit still, Demosthenes told the assembly. He is always moving. Every delay gives him time. Every concession he takes as license for the next move. He is not at war with Athens today, but he is already treating every Athenian interest as an obstacle to be cleared. If we do not act now, we will act later, under conditions entirely of his choosing. The assembly heard him, debated, sent embassies, and did not act with anything close to adequate force. Part of this was faction. Part of it was money. Military action against Macedon was expensive and the returns uncertain. And part of it was the existence of an influential faction that didn't share Demosthenes' alarm at all. The most articulate version of that position came not from a demagogue, but from Isocrates, the most respected intellectual in Athens, 90 years old, who had spent his life writing about pan-Hellenic unity. Isocrates wrote Philip a letter. Remarkable in its naivety, devastating in its timing. Unite the Greeks, he urged. Lead them against Persia. Be the Agamemnon of this age. Philip read this letter and was, one imagines, quietly delighted, because what Isocrates was telling him was that a significant portion of the Greek intellectual establishment not only accepted his rise, they wanted it. The philosopher who represented the pinnacle of Greek civic aspiration was asking the semi-barbarian king from the north to take charge. If Isocrates could be persuaded, the argument against Philip was already half lost before any army moved. In 346 BC, the Peace of Philocrates made it official. Athens, exhausted by the sacred war and diplomatically isolated, negotiated with Philip. The peace was presented as an agreement between equals. It was not. Philip had maneuvered Athens into formally recognizing his existing gains and accepting his role in Greek affairs as legitimate. He then moved south, ended the sacred war on his own terms, and took a seat on the Amphictyonic Council, the body that governed Delphi and embodied the religious conscience of the Greek world. Demosthenes was part of the Athenian delegation that negotiated this peace. He came back knowing, with the specific, nauseating clarity of a man who has just watched his worst predictions materialize in real time, that Athens had made a catastrophic mistake. The peace had not contained Philip. It had given him a title and a chair at the table. And the table Philip had just demonstrated was the one that mattered. After 346 BC, Philip stopped pretending. The patience was still there. The method was still there. But the diplomatic cover became thinner, the movements more direct, the message more naked. He moved into Thrace, absorbing the northern Aegean coastline and, crucially, the access routes to the Black Sea, the route along which Athens received the grain that fed its population. Every Thracian city that submitted was absorbed. Every city that resisted met engineers who had learned to crack city walls in ways no Greek defensive architecture had been built to stop. Then he turned on the Chalcidian League, his former allies, the cities he had gifted Potidaea to, the ones who had welcomed Macedonian partnership when it served them. When absorbing them became more useful than maintaining the friendship, Philip besieged Olynthus. The city fell in 348 BC. He razed it, sold its survivors into slavery, erased it with a thoroughness that was not rage, it was calculation. A message, cold and precise. This is what happens to cities that misjudge their relationship with Macedon. Demosthenes delivered the Olympiac speeches before the city fell, pleading with Athens to send enough to matter. Athens sent forces, not enough, not in time. Olynthus burned, and Greek resistance in the north burned with it. Philip was not finished. In 340 BC, he besieged Perinthus and Byzantium, the cities that sat on the straits between the Aegean and the Black Sea, directly across Athens's grain route. This was unambiguous. A successful siege gave Philip the ability to starve Athens into submission without ever marching into Attica. Athens declared war. But here is the thing about that declaration of war. By the time Athens made it, Philip had already positioned himself to fight it on ground of his choosing, at a moment of his choosing, with an army no Greek city could match. The declaration was what he wanted. It gave him a pretext. He withdrew from the sieges, not because he was beaten, but because he no longer needed those cities, and marched instead on Amphissa, which had committed a religious offense against the Amphictyonic sanctuary. The same legal institution he had joined 12 years earlier now served as justification for military movement into central Greece. He occupied the pass at Thermopylae. Let that land for a moment. Thermopylae. The same narrow pass where Leonidas and 300 Spartans had died holding back Persia 2 centuries earlier. The symbolic gateway between the north and the Greek south. Philip was standing on the Greek side of it, with a professional army that no coalition in Greece had yet stopped, looking south toward Athens and Thebes and everything that still called itself free. Athens finally felt what Demosthenes had been saying for 15 years, not heard it, felt it, in the language of boots on stone and dust rising on the road south, emergency diplomacy, ambassadors to every city that would receive them. Most cities declined. They had watched Olynthus burn. They had watched the peace of Philocrates buy Philip everything and Athens nothing. Joining a coalition against Philip at this stage looked identical to signing your own death warrant. But Thebes said yes. Thebes. The city where Philip had spent 3 years as a hostage. The city whose military genius had built his understanding of war. The city that still fielded the sacred band. The same 300 men who had broken Sparta at Leuctra, whose legend was written in the blood of Spartan hoplites on a Boeotian plain. For the first time in decades, Athens and Thebes were on the same side. Philip tried to negotiate. He sent ambassadors to Thebes with terms: neutrality, or better yet, cooperation, and Thebes would be rewarded. But Demosthenes was already inside that assembly, and whatever he said, we have no record of the speech, only its consequence. It was enough. Thebes joined Athens. For the first time in a generation, Greece's 2 greatest remaining powers stood together. A combined army assembled in Boeotia, numbering perhaps 30,000 or more. If this coalition held, if it could defeat Philip here, in the heart of Greece, everything he had built over 20 years could unravel. If they lost, it was over. Everything that followed came down to a single afternoon. 338 BC late summer, the plain of Cheronea, Boeotia. Broad, relatively flat, bounded north by the Cephissus River, south by hills. Neither side had a decisive terrain advantage. The Greek coalition deployed Athens on the right flank, Thebes, including the sacred band, on the left. Philip's Macedonians stood opposite, veterans on his right facing Athens, and on the Macedonian left, facing the sacred band, the companion cavalry. In command of that cavalry, his 18-year-old son, Alexander. This placement was not a gesture of pride. It was the most precise military decision of the battle. Philip had spent 20 years studying the sacred band. He knew that when everything else broke, the sacred band would hold. You couldn't break it with infantry from the front. The only way to destroy it was to hit it from a direction it couldn't turn to face, and the only unit fast enough to do that was cavalry. The battle opened with something that looked, to the Athenians opposite, like a miracle. Philip's right wing, his veterans, began to pull back. A controlled withdrawal, angling backward in good order, unhurried. Nothing like a rout. But from the Athenian side, from men who had marched to this field carrying 20 years of accumulated fear and outrage and the desperate hope that Philip was not, in fact, invincible, what they saw was the Macedonians retreating, running, breaking. The Athenians went forward. An Athenian general, likely Stratocles, is said to have screamed that they would chase the Macedonians all the way to Macedonia. The men believed him. They moved faster. Formation discipline evaporated as excitement overwhelmed training. The Athenian line extended, thinned, and in the gap between the accelerating Athenian right and the stationary Theban left, a space opened in the Greek center that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. Alexander saw it. The companion cavalry did not trot into the gap. They charged. Wedge formation, full speed, 300 horsemen hitting the Greek center at a point it could not defend and could not close in time. Simultaneously, Philip's veterans stopped, halted mid-withdrawal, turned, advanced. The Athenians, who had been screaming in pursuit, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that was no longer running, and realized, in the same horrible instant, that they had outrun their own formation. The trap had taken seconds to spring, years to build. The sacred band held. In the collapsing chaos of that afternoon, the Athenian right crumbling, the Greek center gone, the battle turning into a rout around them, The sacred band did what it existed to do. It did not run. It locked shields and fought. It fought as cavalry hit it from the flank. It fought as Macedonian infantry pressed from the front. It fought as the sound and dust and screaming of a battle already decided closed in from every side. All 300 died where they stood. When it was over, they were found lying in formation, facing the enemy. Not a single wound in the back. Philip reportedly walked to where they lay and wept. Whether that actually happened is uncertain. Ancient sources had an appetite for the poignant. But it feels true. It feels like exactly what a man who had spent 3 years living among them would do when he saw what his own plan had cost. 1,000 Athenians were dead. 2,000 more were prisoners. The survivors were running. The Battle of Chaeronea was finished before the sun had moved far across the sky. The Greece that had defined itself through the independence and sovereign will of its city-states, through citizen soldiers who stood on those fields because they voted to, was over. Not wounded. Over. The political entity that had produced Pericles, Socrates, Aeschylus, Thucydides, the one that had stopped Persia and built the Parthenon and invented the jury trial, that entity had just lost the only battle that ever truly mattered. And Philip had not yet made his most audacious move. Philip did not march on Athens. Athens was preparing for a siege it couldn't survive. Ships recalled. Silver assessed. Demosthenes delivered a funeral oration for the Athenian dead that was, by every account, extraordinary. The last great act of the orator who had been right about everything and ignored about everything, giving words to a city holding its breath, waiting for the end. The end didn't come. Not the way anyone expected. Philip sent the Athenian prisoners home, without ransom. He accompanied them with an honor guard and with the cremated ashes of Athens's fallen, transported with full military ceremony. He allowed Athens to keep its fleet, the most powerful navy in the Greek world, its democratic institutions, its trade routes, its internal laws. Athens was stunned. This is not what conquerors do. This was not mercy, or not only mercy. Philip was already thinking past Chaeronea. He wanted to attack Persia. He had wanted it for years, and not just for the wealth, though the wealth of the Persian Empire would have made Macedon unimaginably rich. He wanted the narrative. A king who led the Greek world in a crusade against the ancient enemy was not a conqueror. He was a savior. He was, exactly as a Socrates had asked, the Agamemnon of this age. To build that campaign, he needed Athens, its ships, its expertise, its prestige, its name. A resentful, occupied Athens with a wrecked navy was worth almost nothing. A grateful, cooperative Athens that had been treated fairly was worth everything. He marched on Thebes instead, where he installed a garrison and replaced the democracy with an oligarchy. Thebes had been the last holdout, the last city to join the coalition against him. It needed to be punished enough to make the lesson clear, but not destroyed, because destroying cities produces rubble, not revenue. Then Philip convened the League of Corinth. In 337 BC, representatives of virtually every Greek city-state assembled. Sparta declined. As Sparta declined most things it found inconvenient, and Philip let them sit in irrelevance. Every other major state sent delegates. The League established a common peace, a universal Greek truce that no single city had managed to sustain through 2 centuries of diplomacy. It established a joint council with procedures for resolving disputes. It explicitly preserved the internal autonomy of member cities, their assemblies, their courts, their laws, and it named Philip hegemon, leader of the League, with military command in the event of external threats. The League formally declared war on Persia and commissioned Philip to lead it. Read the language carefully. Not conqueror, not king of kings. Hegemon, leader. The same term that Athens had once held leading the Delian League, that Sparta had held leading the Peloponnesian League. Philip was not dismantling the Greek political framework. He was placing himself at the top of it, using Greek vocabulary, operating through Greek legal forms, occupying a role that Greeks had filled before and knew how to understand. He had not conquered Greece. He had become its chairman, and a chairman who commands the only professional army on the continent is, in every sense that matters, indistinguishable from an emperor. But the word matters. The story matters. It allowed Greeks to tell themselves something they could live with, something that wasn't the end, something that wasn't simply, we lost. That was the deepest genius of what Philip built, not the sarissa, not the companion cavalry, the story he gave to the people he had just defeated, so that they could accept defeat as something other than defeat. Philip never got to lead his Persian campaign. In the summer of 336 BC, his daughter Cleopatra was married to the king of Epirus. A lavish celebration at Aegae, the old Macedonian royal capital, attended by dignitaries from across the Greek world. Philip walked into the open theater that morning without his bodyguards. This was apparently deliberate, a show of confidence. The most powerful man in the Greek world had nothing to fear from his own people. A young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias stepped out of the crowd and stabbed him. Philip died on the ground of the theater. The conspiracy has been argued over for 2,000 years. Pausanias had a personal grievance, brutal, specific, a story of humiliation that Philip had failed to address adequately. But personal grievances don't usually kill kings in theaters without help. Who helped? Olympias, Philip's estranged Epirot queen, was immediately suspected. She had motive. She had enemies at court, and her son Alexander benefited most directly from Philip's death. Whether Alexander himself knew has never been proven and probably never will be. Persian money may have been involved, buying through assassination what Persian armies had failed to achieve through invasion. Or it was exactly what it appeared. One man's private rage finding the most consequential moment possible to detonate. What came next was fast, faster than anyone expected. Alexander, 20 years old, moved with a speed that made even experienced men blink. He secured the Macedonian army's loyalty. It had loved Philip, but armies love victory more. And this young man was Philip's heir in the only sense an army ultimately cares about. Rival claimants to the throne were executed. Greek delegations arrived with expressions of continued cooperation, delivered with varying degrees of conviction. Then word came that the Greek cities were moving. Thebes was first. Believing Philip's death created an opening, believing, with fatal miscalculation, that without Philip the Macedonian army would faction and dissolve. Thebes expelled its Macedonian garrison and proclaimed liberty. Other cities stirred. Demosthenes, who had no way of knowing how catastrophically wrong he was about what was coming, was reportedly seen in the streets of Athens, celebrating. Alexander took his army south. He moved so fast that by the time Thebes had fully understood he was coming, he was already at the walls. He offered terms. Thebes declined. What followed was a siege and a storm and a destruction so thorough it stunned the entire Greek world. 30,000 Thebans sold into slavery. The city leveled, its land redistributed to its neighbors. Philip had made examples. Alexander made monuments out of them. He spared the temples. He spared the house of Pindar, the great Theban poet. The gesture was not compassion. It was precision messaging. Macedon honors Greek civilization. Macedon annihilates Greek insubordination. These two things are entirely compatible. Silence fell across Greece like a stone dropped into deep water. No city moved. No city followed Thebes. Demosthenes went quiet. The League of Corinth reaffirmed its commitments, and within a year, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with his father's army, his father's engineers, and his father's strategy, and began taking Persia apart piece by piece, all the way to the edge of the known world. The conquest of Persia, the campaign that carried Alexander from the Hellespont to Egypt to Persepolis to the banks of the Indus, was the most spectacular military achievement in ancient history, and it was Philip's creation. The army was Philip's. The combined arms doctrine was Philip's. The logistics were Philip's. The League of Corinth framework that gave Alexander a Greek coalition to lead was Philip's. Without Philip, there is no Alexander in the form history remembers. There is a capable young king who probably gets stopped somewhere around Thrace. But what happened to Greece while the conquest was running? The polis, the self-governing city-state, the foundational unit of Greek civilization for 4 centuries, never recovered its political independence. After Chaeronea, Greek cities retained their institutions in the way that a stage set retains the appearance of a room. The furniture is in place, the walls are standing, but nothing structural exists behind the surface. Assemblies still met. Courts still sat. Plays were still written and performed. But the decisions that shaped a civilization's fate, war, peace, alliance, the external projection of power, were made in Macedon. Demosthenes lived long enough to see all of it. He spent the years after Chaeronea in a cycle of resistance and failure, building coalitions that dissolved, accepting bribes, being prosecuted, exiled, returning. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, Demosthenes came back to Athens to encourage the rebellion that immediately erupted, the Lamian War, Greece's final serious attempt to throw off Macedonian control. A Macedonian fleet destroyed the Athenian navy. A Macedonian army marched south. Athens surrendered. The democracy was abolished and replaced with an oligarchy. Demosthenes fled to the island of Caloria. When Macedonian agents arrived to take him, he swallowed poison he had been carrying for exactly this contingency. He had spent his life being right about everything. He died on a small island, having been ignored until nothing could be done. The world that followed, the Hellenistic world, the world built on Philip's foundation and Alexander's momentum, was vast and culturally extraordinary. Greek spread east as a language of commerce and government. Alexandria became the greatest library and intellectual center the ancient world had seen. The philosophy, the mathematics, the dramatic tradition of the classical Greek city-state traveled further and lasted longer inside the Hellenistic empires than it might ever have inside a Greece that remained a collection of rival sovereign city-states. Greek eventually became the language in which the New Testament was written. The influence was permanent, genuinely permanent, but it traveled as cargo inside a larger system, not as the output of free cities governing themselves. Philip ended Greek political independence and created the conditions for Greek cultural dominance. Whether that exchange is tragedy or achievement depends entirely on which Greeks you ask, and on what you think civilization is actually for. Here is the question that keeps surfacing no matter how many times you think you've resolved it. Why? Why did Persia, with 2 invasions, limitless gold, and the largest army the ancient world had assembled, fail so completely? And why did Philip, with a fraction of those resources and a kingdom that nearly didn't survive its first year, succeed so thoroughly? The answer is not military. The difference between Persia's failure and Philip's success was not generalship or logistics or tactics, though all of those mattered at the margins. The difference was timing. Persia came to Greece when the city-states were at the peak of their political energy. The democratic institutions were new and vital. Citizen soldiers were fighting for something they had built themselves, something they believed in with the particular ferocity that only recent creation produces. They were afraid of Persia, afraid in the way that sharpens and clarifies rather than paralyzes, and that fear produced, for one critical decade, a pan-Hellenic unity that their normal hatreds made impossible. Athens and Sparta looked outward together, and Persia broke against them. Philip came after 100 years of Greeks looking inward. The Peloponnesian War did not merely kill soldiers or drain treasuries. It corroded the foundational trust that political community requires. It produced generations of Greeks who had watched their own cities commit atrocities against other Greek cities. Athens massacring the entire male population of Melos, Sparta overseeing the execution of every man in Plataea, Olynthus erased from the map just 12 years before Chaeronea. The idea that Greeks formed a community with obligations to each other, the idea that had made Marathon possible, had been badly, perhaps irreparably, damaged. The city-state remained the center of identity. The broader solidarity that had stopped Persia was gone. Philip walked into that vacuum, and he brought something the exhausted Greek world genuinely craved: the prospect of stability. Not domination, stability. A final end to the cycle: Spartan hegemony, Athenian hegemony, Theban hegemony, each one generating a coalition that eventually toppled it in turn. The wheel of Greek power politics spinning endlessly and leaving everyone poorer with every rotation. Philip offered something different: a leader who sat outside the Greek system, who could claim to be above factional politics rather than the instrument of any single city's ambition. Isocrates was not a fool. He was, in his way, reading something real. He saw that Greece needed a unifier who was strong enough to hold the position without becoming another Athens, an outside player who could absorb the resentment that any Greek hegemon would inevitably generate. He was wrong about Philip's ultimate intentions. Philip was not a philosopher king serving Greek interests. He was a conqueror serving Macedonian power. But the need Isocrates identified was real, and Philip exploited it with the precision of a surgeon. This is the pattern that makes Philip's story not merely ancient history. The most durable conquests in history are not the ones where the winner destroys everything. They are the ones where the conquered are given a story in which they are not defeated, but reorganized, not subjugated, but led, not broken, but redirected toward a shared purpose. Philip did not take Greece's identity. He reframed it. He offered Greeks the narrative of a pan-Hellenic crusade against their ancient enemy, and enough of them found it acceptable, even genuinely appealing, that resistance never achieved the unity it needed to succeed. Demosthenes stood in the assembly and told Athens precisely what was coming. He was right about everything. Athens debated and deliberated and found reasons to act too slowly, and then it was too late. There is no more Athenian story than that, and no more human one. Philip of Macedon died at 46, a knife in a theater, at his own daughter's wedding. The Persian campaign he had spent his life building toward still unlaunched. He never set foot in Persia. He never stood in Persepolis. Everything he had built, the army, the doctrine, the diplomatic architecture, the momentum, was picked up by a 20-year-old who carried it to the edge of the known world and kept going. History remembers Alexander. History always remembers the man who finishes the journey, not the one who made it possible. But strip Philip out of the equation, and Alexander is a capable young king with a solid army who probably gets stopped somewhere north of Thessaly. The military revolution was Philip's. The professional army was Philip's. The League of Corinth was Philip's. The idea that a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia was both legitimate and achievable, Philip seeded that into the Greek imagination over 20 years of careful positioning. Alexander inherited the most perfectly prepared campaign in ancient history and executed it with genius, but he did not invent it. Philip didn't conquer Greece by being stronger than Greece. He conquered it by understanding Greece better than Greece understood itself. He saw the exhaustion underneath the rhetoric. He saw the faction inside the unity. He saw that Greeks needed a story more than they needed another champion. And he gave them one. A story in which the real enemy had always been Persia, always external, always the barbarian, and in which a Macedonian king was not a threat to Greek civilization, but its long-delayed and natural protector. The Persians tried to break the gates down. Philip offered to be the gatekeeper. He never stopped moving. From the moment he took the regency in 359 BC to the moment the knife found him in 336, he was always thinking further ahead than the people around him. Always planning the next move, while his enemies were still processing the last one. That capacity, to hold a long game in clear focus while playing each day's short game flawlessly, is rarer than military genius. And in the ancient world, it may have been more powerful. Greece never had a chance. Not because Greeks were weak, because the man approaching them had spent his entire life learning the specific shape of their weaknesses, and because enough of them were too tired, too divided, or too willing to find a palatable story in what was happening to ever find the unity that might have stopped him. 2.5 millennia later, we still read their tragedies. We still argue about their democracy. We still teach their philosophy in universities that, in a very real sense, exist because of the world the Hellenistic empires built on Philip's foundation. All of it survived. The ideas, the language, the forms of thought, the freedom that made it possible did not. That is the thing about Philip of Macedon that lingers long after the battles and the dates and the political arrangements have faded. He didn't just win. He won in a way that left the people he defeated unable to entirely call it defeat. And that, more than the Sarissa, more than Chaeronea, more than the League of Corinth, is the achievement that has no real parallel in ancient history. He conquered a civilization, and the civilization said thank you.